Good morning, good morning. You know, one of the great things when I see that video with Phil Templeton, a guy who, when he retired, just said, God, what can you do with my life now? And as a welder his whole life, God said, why don't you teach others how to weld? And one of the things that we do as a church, and part of your offerings, is if a young man goes through his whole program, we provide the welder and a helmet and a set of gloves so that young man can then now go start a business. And so out of your offerings, we're the ones who buy the welders, and we buy the gloves, and we buy the helmets, and all of that stuff. And so not only is he discipling, but he's also helping them move ahead in life. So, and man, I want you to know that April the 12th, the week of April the 12th, so it's the week after, not Thanksgiving, Easter. The week after Easter this year, men, we're going to go to Costa Rica, and we're going to work with Phil and help some churches in the area that just need some rebuilding, some things repaired. And so I'm only taking men. Sorry, ladies. I know every time I do that, I get all these nasty emails from ladies, like, why can't I go? Right? Largely because of housing and things like that. It's just easier if we just have one gender. Robin is hopefully planning a trip in 2026 that will be just ladies, okay? So, man, just for you, it will be a construction trip. And even if you go, I don't have any skills, well, come along because we're a mile from the beach. And it's a beautiful place in Costa Rica, and come join us. I did want to just comment for just a minute. If you study what's going on in America right now, outside of the political mess we're in, there is a revival in America among young people. Young people are coming back to the church in droves. And I was looking at our worship team this morning, and other than the 31-year-old kid on the guitar, every single one up here was under 20, leading us in worship this morning. I think that's pretty awesome. And what a great job they did. And one of the things that we talked about in first service was very clappy today. They paved the way for your service, because one of the things that you find out in Scripture is one of the sounds that the enemy of your soul hates the most is the sound of applause unto the Lord. Now, we can applaud, at the movies or the Broadway show or whatever, but when it's applause unto the Lord, the enemy hates it. And so first service was just very applaudy. If that's a word, I just made it up. Just make sure you give me credit. But what it did was it then drove out the enemy, so the distractions and everything else were clear so that God could do what he wanted to do. And so let's start the message this morning with applause unto the Lord, can we? So that we can just get ourselves ready. Come on. Good job. Awesome. I want to talk to you this morning about miracles. We've started a new series, and what I'm calling it is Memorial Stones of Gratitude. And we're going to look at the story this morning, where the idea of this sermon series even came from. Pastor Jack spoke to you last week. He talked to you about the table. So you see our memorial stone up here that's got the table as a reminder. I'm going to talk to you about miracles this morning. Next week there'll be a new rock. Pastor Robin is going to preach to you next week, and she's good. So you'll want to be here for Pastor Robin. She's going to talk to you, I think, about legacy. So I want to talk to you about miracles this morning. One of the things that I was thinking about is part of the reason why they're called miracles is because they don't happen all the time. Could you imagine if God did the miracle every time we asked him? What would happen is we would begin to coast through life and not contend for life. If God, every time I got myself into trouble, he bailed me out, which he does, just not always instantly. Or God, every time instantly I said, I need, and he did the miracle in my lap, eventually I would just learn to not even ask and just kind of coast through life. And part of the thing about miracles is they don't happen all the time. And that's why they're called miracles. And oftentimes it's because there is no answer. Whatever is in front of you, whatever mountain you face, whatever addiction you can't beat, whatever problem you can't seem to overcome, like there just seems to be no way. And that's where we call upon the miracles of God, because there just seems to be no way. And I've got news for you, church. I've got good news for you, that we serve the miracle-working God. Wow, only one amen to that. Thank you. Like I was really starting to get nervous. Like second service doesn't believe we believe in the miracle-working God. You need to help me here, second service. I think maybe you're still asleep. But imagine when we come to the Lord and it requires this faith and this hope and this courage to keep asking, God, I need to see an answer. I need to see an answer. And one of the things that I find in my own life, that when I'm facing the obstacle, when I'm really praying and contending and believing for a miracle, there's a certain something I've been praying for like 6 months. And one of the questions that I ask, and maybe you're like me, is every day I wake up and I ask this question: is this the day, God? Is this the day? Is this going to be it? Is this the day when I'm going to see the answer? Is this the day? And then the other thing that I ask is, as I try to figure it out for him, how it's going to happen. Anybody else do that? And then I ask this question: is this the way? Is this the way it's going to happen? Is this the day, and is this the way? And more often than not, I find out that God has a completely different way, and something I've never even thought of. Why? Because I'm going to read your scripture in a minute that says his ways are not our ways. And so I want to talk to you this morning about miracles. And I want to start by looking at a miracle story in the book of Joshua. And let me set the foundation for you as we get into this story. Israel is in captivity in Egypt. You know the story. Moses, he gets chosen by God to lead his people out. He goes to Pharaoh, says, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. Then you have all the plagues that happen, and finally Pharaoh's like, okay, get out of here. And so Moses leads the people out of Egypt. They get to the Red Sea. Now the Egyptian army, Pharaoh's changed his mind, and he sent his army to go after the people of Israel again. And now in front of them is a Red Sea, and behind them is an army coming after them. And they're stuck. They don't know what to do. And so God says to Moses, he says, hey, just lift up your staff, and I'll make a way for you. How many of you knew, if you were in the middle of that, probably the way, you were saying, God, is this the way? You probably never would have thought God would have parted the Red Sea and that you would walk across on dry ground. But God said, this is the way. And he leads the people of Israel through the Red Sea. He parts the Red Sea, and they get to the other side. And as they get to the other side, God closes the Red Sea as the Egyptian army is going through and completely wipes out the army. Now it's 40 years later. 40 years later. And now Israel again is at the edge of a body of water. And God has promised them a land flowing with milk and honey. They can see it. They're on the edge of the Jordan River. It's on the other side of the Jordan River, and they can see it. They can see the promise. They can see the answer. But once again, a body of water is between them and the promise. And God says, I'm going to make a way for you. And so that's where we catch the story in the book of Joshua. Joshua 1, verse 1, I love it. It says this, Moses is dead. That's literally how you're like, let me read this book, right? It starts off with like this great opening line. And he says, but now, Joshua, I've chosen you to lead my people, and now you'll get to lead them into the promised land. This land that I've promised you, this land flowing with milk and honey. And so now we get into Joshua chapter 3. If you'll follow along with me, I just want to highlight some things today in Joshua chapter 3. It says, early the next morning, Joshua and all the Israelites left the acacia grove and arrived at the banks of the Jordan River, where they camped before crossing. 3 days later, the Israelite officers went through the camp, giving instructions to the people, when you see the Levitical priests carry the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, move out from your positions and follow them. For you have never traveled this way before, and I will guide you. So when we say, God, is this the way? Part of what he's going to say, nope, you've never gone this way before. I'm going to lead you in a way you've never gone before. He says, stay about a half a mile behind them and keep a clear distance between you and the ark and make sure you don't come any closer. Then Joshua told the people, purify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do great wonders among you. And in the morning Joshua said to the priests, lift up the ark of the covenant and lead the people across the river. And so they started out and went ahead of the people. And the Lord told Joshua, today I will make you a great leader in the eyes of all the Israelites. They will know that I am with you, just as I was with Moses. Give the command to the priests who carry the ark of the covenant. When you reach the banks of the Jordan River, take a few steps into the river and stop there. So Joshua told the Israelites, come and listen to what the Lord your God says. Today you will know that the living God is among you. He will surely drive out the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, and all the other ites ahead of you. Look, the ark of the covenant, which belongs to the Lord of the whole earth, will lead you across the Jordan River. Now choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe, and the priests will carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth. And as soon as their feet touch the water, the flow of the water will be cut off upstream, and the river will stand up like a wall. And so the people left their camp to cross the Jordan River, and the priests who were carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. It was the harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing at its banks. But as soon as the feet of the priests who were carrying the ark touched the water at the river's edge, the water above that point, backing up a great distance away at a town called Adam, which is near Zarethan. And the water below that point flowed into the Dead Sea until the riverbed was dry. And then all the people crossed over near the town of Jericho. Meanwhile, the priests who were carrying the ark of the Lord's covenant stood on dry ground in the middle of the riverbed as the people passed by. And they waited there until the whole nation of Israel had crossed the Jordan on to dry ground. It's interesting because one of the things that we'll look at is there's a parting of a body of water upon the exit of Egypt, and now there's a parting of a body of water upon entering the Promised Land. Between those is 40 years. One of the things that we're going to look at in just a minute is it could have been 40 days. But because of unbelief, it took them 40 years. It took them 40 years to get to a place where God says, I'm going to separate this body of water. The other thing that is interesting is that at the Jordan River, they stood there for 3 days. And I don't know if you could imagine that you've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and now you're on the bank of the river, and 2 miles across, you can see the land God promised you. But there's a 2-mile river in front of you. At that time, the Jordan River is about 2 miles wide. It's about 120 feet deep. And the nation of Israel is about 3 million people. So when you begin to think about the miracle that God did of stopping some water, parting a sea, that 3 million people could walk across. And then at the end of it, he says, now grab some rocks. We'll look at that in just a minute. One of the things I began to think about is how many times I've crossed a stream that has recently dried up, and how many of you know it wasn't dry ground? You ever been to the beach when tide is out and you try to stand on the sand, and how many of you know it's not dry ground? How many of you know when you begin to walk through mud, your feet sink? Sometimes it sucks your shoes off your feet. Sometimes you get it down into your knees and you can't get out, and you have friends that you say, hey, help me out of the mud, and they laugh at you. Could you imagine if God didn't dry the ground? You had 3 million people crossing through mud. And so what I want you to catch is that when God does something, he does it right. When God does something, he does it right. And so the Israelites begin to walk across. And one of the things that I was just thinking about is when you start asking yourself, is this the day, God? Is this the way? How do you contend for a miracle when the water's still flowing? How do you contend for a water? And so let's pick up the story now in Joshua chapter 4. It says, when all the people of Israel had crossed the Jordan, God said to Joshua, now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them to take 12 stones from the very place where the priests were standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up at the place where you camp tonight. And we will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, what do these stones mean? And then you can tell them, it reminds us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across, and these stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever. So God gets the people across the Jordan River. And then he says, where the ark stopped, where the priest stopped in the middle of the dry ground, go grab some rocks. And he says this, I want you to set that pile of rocks up where you camp, where you're living. I want you to set a pile of rocks there. And here's why. When your kids ask you, what do those rocks mean? You're going to pass on the story of the miracle that I just did for you. And what I want you to catch, if you only catch one thing this morning, I'm going to show you in a minute that what God wanted them to be able to do was pass on the miracle stories so that the future generations don't go back to a place of unbelief. That the future generations don't go back to a place of Israel, back to unbelief. And if you understand the history of Israel, that was kind of their cycle. They would forget God, and the next generation would rise up without God. And so I want to show you some things in Scripture. The first thing that I want to talk about is the miracle on exit and the miracle on entrance. God parted the Red Sea when they exited Egypt. God parts the Jordan River upon the entrance to the Promised Land. And the difference is this. One of them, God just kicked open the door. Their backs up against the wall. The Egyptian army is coming. There's a Red Sea in front of them. They're stuck. They don't know what to do. And God just says, Moses, lift up your hands. And bam, look at the miracle I just did. Kicks open a door, parts the Red Sea. The Israelites walk across on dry ground. Now, 40 years later, they're in the same place. There's the Promised Land. That's the land I promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. But there between you, there's a Jordan River. Notice what he says this time. You got to step into the water. How many of you know there are times that a miracle comes in your life that God's going to kick open a door for you, and there's other times he's going to say, you got to take a step of faith. You want that water to part? Step in it. Step in it. I want to emphasize that in just a little bit more, but that was the difference between the two miracles. The other difference in the two miracles is one could have taken place in 40 days, but it took place in 40 years. Largely because of unbelief. Largely because of unbelief. And so when we start talking about why do we put up a memorial stone, a stone of remembrance for our children to say, what do these stones represent? Because we don't want them to go back to a place of unbelief. The interesting thing is, and I'll show you in just a second, that Israel could have entered the Promised Land. The land that God promised them, Israel could have entered it in 40 days. 40 days. Instead, it took them 40 years. 40 years. And the difference of why it took so long was because of unbelief. Let me show you in Numbers chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13, it says, after exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses and Aaron, the whole community of Israel, at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran, and they reported to the whole community what they had seen. And they showed them the fruit that they had taken from the land, and this was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it's indeed a bountiful country. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, and here's the kind of fruit it produces. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified, and we saw giants there. The descendants of Anak, and the Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live along the coast and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb, he tried to quiet the people as he stood before Moses, and he said this, let's go and take the land. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes there. And all the people we saw were huge. Even we saw giants there, and next to them we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought of us too. I just began to think about how often Like I'm praying and contending for God to do something that I just don't see a way. And then all of a sudden I get this, but we can't. Or you can't. Or they are. Or it is. Or because. Like we find every excuse why God can't. And that's where the Israelites are at. They're like, we can't go. We can't go. And sometimes the delay in your miracle is because of the excuse you're making. And your inability to take a step and say, no, God promised it, let's step into it. Let me show you in Numbers 14. And then the Lord said, I will pardon them as you have requested. Now I'm at verse 21. But as surely as I live, and as surely as this earth is filled with the Lord's glory, not one of these people will ever enter that land. They have all seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I performed in both Egypt and in the wilderness. But again and again they have tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. They will never see the land I swore to give to their ancestors. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. But my servant Caleb has a different attitude than the others have. He has remained loyal to me, and I will bring him into the land that he explored, and his descendants will possess and their full share of that land. Now turn around. Don't go on towards the land where the Amalekites and the Canaanites live. Tomorrow you must set out for the wilderness back in the direction of the Red Sea. And then he says this, because your men explored the land for 40 days, you must wander in the wilderness for 40 years. A year for each day, suffering the consequences of your sins. Did you catch that? After 40 days, they could have stepped into the promise that God had given them. After 40 days. But instead, because of unbelief, because of, no, God, they're so big, can you really? You're making all these excuses. Here's what God said. You're not going to go forward in life now, you're going to go back to where you were. And you're going to go back to where you were 1 year for every day those men spent in that land. 40 years they wandered because of unbelief. 40 years they wandered because of unbelief. Third thing I want you to say is this the way? Is this the way? So often we pray for a miracle, right? And I said, God, is it today? Is this the day? And God, is this the way? Is this the way it's going to happen? Usually it happens in a way you never thought of. You never thought of. I was thinking back to when we bought this building 9 years ago, and we had to come up with a ginormous down payment. And you just pray and believe that God's going to provide and people are going to give. And I started deciding for God how it was going to happen. I would see some of you pulling in your Mercedes, and I'd be like, so God, maybe they could skip a payment. And they could, I know that person, they just got a promotion, and hopefully, God, they become, and I would plan for God how it would happen. And out of the blue, God would say, Kurt, here's how it's going to go. And I was constantly reminded that God has ways we don't know anything about. There was a family that had watched one service online, one service, and they had inherited some money, and they wrote a massive check and sent it to the church. Now, I never prayed that, I never thought that, but God said, Kurt, I have a different way. And so often we decide for God, this is the way it's going to happen. God, I need a miracle, and you're going to do it this way. And let me read to you out of the book of Isaiah. It says, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts. My ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. So when we begin to say, God, is this the way? Here's what I'm going to tell you. His way is not our way. The way He's going to answer, the way He's going to provide is not going to be the same way. And number two, He will make a way where there seems to be no way. God will make a way where there seems to be no way. But one of the things that He says to do is to follow the priest and the ark. When it came to the parting of the Jordan River, who were the ones who took the risk? The priests, right? The priests were the ones who had to step into the water. Sometimes we got to get our feet wet. Sometimes we got to take that step of faith. And then the Israelites, all they had to do was to follow the ark of the Lord that the priests were carrying, I just want to remind you that the ark, there was 3 things inside the ark. One of the things that was inside the ark was the stone tablets from the 10 Commandments. One of the things that was a reminder of the promises of God. So when they see the ark, they're reminded of the promises of God. The other thing that's inside the ark is the staff that Moses' brother Aaron held up. And if you remember the story, it was just a stick. But as he held it up, God caused that stick to come back to life again and began to grow flowers and buds on it again. And so in the Ark of the Covenant is that stick, and it's a reminder of the power of God. The last thing in the ark was some manna. Remember, for 40 days in the wilderness, God provided this thing called manna. And if you study, the word manna literally means, what is it? Nobody knew what it was. But every morning they woke up, and it wasn't, what is it, like, when you go to grandma's house and she makes you something, you're like, I'm not sure what this is, right? I've traveled the world. I've been on so many mission fields, and I could tell you there's been many a meal where they put me in front of me. I'm not sure what this is, Lord, but this was actually the opposite. It's like when you go to somebody's house and you have something that's so amazing, you're like, oh my gosh, what is this? That's literally what manna meant. Like, what is this? And so inside the ark is manna, which was a reminder of the provision of God. And so what God is saying, hey, you've got to take a step of faith, but as you take that step of faith, remember this. Remember my power. Remember the promises I've made to you. Remember the provision that I've given to you. And the ark is a symbol, and so we follow the promise of God, the power of God, and the provision of God. But sometimes we've got to take that first step. I also want to talk to you about the timing. The timing. I said it this way, it's how God syncs the stopping of the water with the step of the priest. It's the syncing of the stop with the step. And what the scripture tells us is that God walls up the water in a town upstream named Adam. It's about 20 miles upstream. And somehow God synced the timing of the moment those priests stepped into the water instantly stopped. There's a timing, and here's what I would tell you, that God has already been working at your miracle. He's waiting for you to take a step. Because there will be a synchronization, there will be a perfect timing when you take that step of what God has already begun to work on your behalf. On your behalf. And then they cross the water, and God says, grab some rocks and put them down in the place where you stay. Because in the future, when your children ask you, what do these rocks mean? You can begin to tell them the story. In the future, I want rocks in the place where I dwell, so that the future generations that I get to serve don't go back to a place of unbelief. And their miracle takes them 40 years instead of 40 days. And so we want to place something in the middle of where we stay. Now, I'm smart enough to know that most of you aren't going to go take a rock and go put it on your kitchen table. It just doesn't fit my decor, Pastor. You may not take a rock, but can you take something that's a visual reminder of the promises of God so that you can have a conversation with the generations behind you of the miracle working power of God, so that we can pass on to the generation so they don't return to a place of unbelief. See, the rocks were just a visual reminder of the miracles of God. And so I began to think about, what are some modern day stones? What are some things we could put in our home? One of the things that Robin and I did early on, and it kind of pains me to think that we didn't continue it, but early on in marriage, we had a little book, and we called it our blessing book. And every time God did a miracle, we wrote the story in that little book. And we used to leave it out on our coffee table so people could read and see the stories of God had answered. And we would read it through with our kids, the miracle. And so maybe one of the things you do is you get your own blessing book and begin to start recording, and you read those stories to your kids and to your grandkids. One of the things that Jack talked about last week was the conversations around the table. And in fact, at the end of the message, in just a couple of minutes, I'm going to put 2 questions for you that I'm going to tell you to take your phone out and take a picture, and you can have that conversation around your dinner table with your kids and with your grandkids. And so we keep passing on the story. In the lobby of our offices, if you go through the double doors and you turn to the right, you'll see a big sign that says there will be miracles today. I bought that sign in Waco, Texas at a place called Magnolia Farms. And it's made out of metal and it weighs about 40 pounds. And I personally carried that home on the airplane. I didn't check it as luggage, it was my carry-on. And I knew if I dropped it, it would slice my toes off, but I still did it. And I put it up in the walls of the office. Why? Because when people walk in to meet with pastors and they have to take a seat for a minute right over the couch, I want them to see, today is your day for a miracle. And I want to make sure that I see it when I walk out. And sometimes, the bills the church has and the giving the church has sometimes look like this. And I got to go, we need a miracle, we're in trouble. And I need to be reminded. Or sometimes I feel like, God, I don't have a word, I don't have a message from you yet. Well, sometimes I need to be reminded that there's a miracle. And so what is the visual reminder that you could put? Maybe you need to go to Hobby Lobby and look for a sign, because Hobby Lobby has great ones. But what's the visual reminder that you can put up in the place where you dwell so that you can pass on your miracle stories to the future generation? Why? Because we don't want our kids or our grandkids to go back to a place of unbelief. We don't want them to travel back to a place of unbelief. And so a memorial stone marks a moment of divine intervention when God intervened in your life. It invites storytelling. When your children ask, what does this represent? It serves as a physical theology. See, it's something that you can point to and say, hey, sometimes we can't see God at work, but we see the end of His work. And these stones are as a reminder to our generations of what God did. And so I want to close with just a couple of things. I'm going to invite the worship team out, or wherever they might be hiding. You'll see them. They'll emerge like ants. Here they come. Three things that I want to close with. Number one, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a night of worship that's about gratitude. And I've titled this sermon, Memorial Stones of Gratitude. Things that we're thankful for, that we can point back to, that we can share the story with our generations. And one of the things we've done, we did it years and years and years ago, was a thing we called cardboard testimonies. And what a cardboard testimony is you get a little piece of cardboard, doesn't have to be more than like this big. And what you do is you write whatever it was before the miracle on the front side. And maybe it was, I got a diagnosis of cancer. Maybe it was, I battled alcoholism for a number of years. And maybe it was my marriage was on the rocks and on the verge of divorce. Maybe it was, I was without a job. But whatever it was before the miracle. And then all you do is you flip the card over and you say, but now. Now marriage is restored and we're coming up on 18 years. Now I've been sober for 9 months. Now I'm cancer free. And it's a chance for us to share the testimony of the goodness of God in our life. Here's the good news. You don't have to say a word. You let your cardboard say it for you. It doesn't need to be wordy because we don't have enough time for you to write a whole story. You just need to write a couple of words. And we'll have cardboard for you out in the next couple weeks. We'll have some available that night, but maybe you have a piece of cardboard at home you want to write on. But our hope is that the night of worship of gratitude is one of the things that we do, is we all get a chance to say, here's what God did in me. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 questions up on the board up here for you. And I'm going to ask you to get out your phone and take a picture of those 2 questions. What would be your definition or description of a miracle? I would love to hear what my 7-year-old grandson and how he would define what a miracle is. I would love to hear, as we go around, maybe my 13-year-old niece of what she thinks a miracle is. Let's just invite conversation at our table. What is a miracle to you? And then the next question, have you seen God do a miracle for you? What a great thing for us to have conversations around the table. Hey, what miracles have you seen God do? So this week, as you take a picture, find a time to sit down with your family, whoever lives in your home. Let's discuss those two questions. And lastly is this. Maybe this morning, you still are waiting for the answer. Maybe this morning you need a miracle. Maybe you're still standing on the banks of the Jordan River and you can see what you need God to do, but there's still a giant obstacle in front of you. And you need God to make a way where there seems to be no way. And the way we were going to close this morning is we want to pray for you. And so I'm going to invite, there's a few that Pastor Dave has spoken to that will pray over folks. I want to invite you to come up now. In fact, church, I'm going to invite you just to stand with us if you would. We're going to close service by singing the God of miracles. And if you need a miracle in your life, I'm going to ask you to take that step. Remember I said sometimes what's between you and the miracle is stepping into the water. I'm going to ask you to take that step. And if you say, I need God to intervene. I've been praying for this for a long time. If you take a step of faith and you come down here, we've got folks down here that will pray over you. And we're just going to take a few minutes. If you don't need the prayer, just take a moment to worship, pray over these that are coming forward. We're just going to take a few minutes and believe in the miracle-working power of God to work in circumstances and situations. So if you need a miracle, come on forward, and the rest of us, why don't we worship with the worship team?